Greetings, class. Um, I have really a very special guest and a very good friend of mine that we're going to visit in regards to a very relevant policy that impacts social workers, especially in the state of Kansas. So to my left or to my right, depending on how you see it, on the screen, is Sherry. So Sherry, if you would maybe take a moment and introduce yourself to my students, I'd appreciate that.
Hi, students. My name is Sherry Hilger, and I'm the Clinical Director for Social Work PRN. Social Work PRN is a national agency that is a social work agency, and we provide various services, but our primary service is providing social work staffing services. So we work with agencies when they have temporary coverage needs. We do some temp to perm also, but we also are involved not only in staffing nationwide, we also work towards providing education and training for social workers, and we also provide supervision for those who are wanting to get an advanced license. I've been with Social Work PRN for over 20 years. I am not native to Kansas or Kansas City. I'm originally from Nebraska, got my undergraduate from the University of Nebraska in social work, and then went and got my master's degree from Jane Addams at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So, but I've been here in Kansas City working as a social worker for 25 years. I've in mental health, healthcare, and I've done some EAP work as well. But I've been here with Social Work PRN, and I've loved every minute of with this organization, and have wonderful experiences working with Gray as well. So, and I'm glad to be here.
All right, that sounds perfect. We won't hold it against you that you're from Nebraska. So we can at least say you're not from Oklahoma. So we got that covered.
There you go. And I am a diehard Kansas fan nowadays. So
Right, Rock Chalk. So
rock chalk.
in 2004, a social work student and Johnson County Mental Health employee, Terry Zinner, went out to visit a client, and the worst thing of all situations occurred, and her life was taken during her home visit. So in 2004, I actually happened to have 3 graduate students in practicum at my private practice. And this really shook up the community because we were doing all in homework at that point in my private practice. Right. And so I remember KU did a town hall meeting with all their practicum students. They brought them all in, and then, you know, had a debriefing with them. Not that all the students knew Terry, but still it would, have a ripple effect. And then the students returned to my practicum, and then we had our own, in-house meeting talking about safety. So in 2011, starting January 1st, it became effective that all social workers being licensed would require a one-time 6-hour CEU on safety training. And I know you've had some investment professionally in regards to this policy and legislation. And so if you maybe would share a little bit of the history of this process for my students, I would really appreciate it.
Well, Gray, as you mentioned, when Terry died in 2004, it was for all of us working in the Kansas City community. It was just quite a shock. We at Social Work PRN were Johnson County Mental Health was one of our clients. We, of course, all had friends and colleagues at Johnson County Mental Health. Terry actually was the sister of my neighbor, so even though I didn't know her personally, I saw that effect as well. So I think at the time, we were all in shock and just so afraid, or so not afraid, but we were mobilized, I think, as a community, along with Terry's family, who were, of course, just overwhelmed by what had happened, to try to assure that this would never happen again to any other social worker or anyone who worked in particularly particularly as a social worker. So there were several ways people got involved. I know for several years, we were involved along with Johnson County Mental Health and others in the community to raise awareness through an annual walk that they did for Terry. But it took a long time before anything really happened towards moving towards legislation. Again, there was a period of time where there was just a lot of awareness, trying to make people consider safety, and social workers maybe having a heightened level of awareness of needing to be safe in their environments, but nothing that was up towards training social workers on how to do this. I mean, there's a lot to consider when it comes to safety training. So I became, I was actually in 2007 at the time that some of this legislation actually got enacted. It was there was legislation introduced in 2007, so it took 3 years before legislation was introduced in the state of Kansas through Congressman Dennis Moore, who had a social worker working for him at the time, Becky Fast, who is now the NASW executive director. So I at that time was I joined the Social Work Advisory Board for the BSRB. So at this time that the legislation was being enacted was a time that I was getting onto the licensing board, and I served on that board for up until last year. So I've seen the course of when it was first introduced to when you had to actually think through how to implement the safety training for social workers, which was, there's a lot of considerations. So that legislation, even though, it was introduced in 2007, it took until 2011 for it to actually go into the rules and regulations for the state of Kansas for social workers. So that's just kind of a little bit the background of how I've been involved.
Why do you think that it took 4 years from legislation in 2000 until implementation in 2011?
Well, as a layperson who kind of watched this along with other pieces of legislation, even though there wasn't, I don't think, as much pushback once the legislation got to. There's several steps that kind of delay the process. Some of it is within the control of those making decisions, and some of it is outside of the control. Once it gets into the legislative process, it may not pass the first time around.
Right.
And it could be not because there was any controversy about the legislation. It just there wasn't enough time in the legislative session to get through all the steps and all the hoops. And this was one of those that there wasn't necessarily a lot of discussion or concerns or not support, but it just never made it through the process the first time around. And so you have to wait till the next session, which is the next year. And so it kind of just keeps getting delayed, even though there's still a lot of discussion about it going on amongst the profession, until it actually gets approved and through both committees and signed by the governor. It's still not to the licensing board where they can start implementing the legislation that had passed. So it just took a lot of time for those steps to go through. Obviously, it took 3 years from the time it was first introduced to when it was passed in the legislative session and signed by the governor.
I think when I think about policy and policy analysis, there's probably 2 key words as a social worker. First off, when I was a young social worker, I had very little interest in policy. But as a little older social worker, I think about perseverance and patience, because change, even though from us now looking back on it, it's a no-brainer. It makes total sense. Why were we not doing it before? Why did we have to have a law to enact those CEUs requirements? But then looking back on it, to understand the perseverance and the patience that a person has to have when they're working with policies, because there are so many requirements, so many hoops, to maybe use a term that you
Yeah.
had mentioned.
Well, and there's various hearings that are held along the way where you have support, people coming to support the legislation, and then there's always going to be someone who brings a different purview of what some of the challenges might be. And, you know, when it comes to education, CEUs for social workers, there are always some considerations, even something as significant and important as this. You know, it's how to implement it in a state where you have very sparsely, there's very sparse opportunities to get training. Not a big deal in Kansas City, Wichita, Topeka, but you have social workers in parts of this state who don't have access to an education program such as this. 6 hours of safety training was a big chunk of our CEUs, and not having speakers available who can train the way the legislation was wanting it to be trained. It couldn't be just safety. It couldn't be just a defense course. It had to give
Right.
both the background of why social workers need, it was about more than just defense. It was about how to de-escalate and how to use our social work skills before you would get into the defense part of it. So to plan that and to find someone who could provide that training and then do it across the state was a major undertaking. So some of the concerns or the pushback might have come from just how, if we're going to make this an educational requirement, how are we going to do it and make sure that social workers have access? Now, today it's available online, but back in 2010, that was not the modality most people were able to get this training. It was done in person. And because there was, part of it was defense training, it had to be, you know, someone who had both skill sets. So it was really hard to find someone who could provide this training. I know in Kansas City, the Kansas City area, we had to identify a national person, Janet Nelson, and she was expensive, which she should be. She was very much the expert in this. So finding ways to pay for the training was another consideration that no one necessarily
Right.
thought. I mean, when you introduce legislation, the intent is really good, but then when you come to implement it, it got hard. And so for, you know, the first few years, people would call us all the time. I'm sure NASW got calls. I'm sure the licensing board got calls. Where could you find this training? And it was very hard to find comfort keepers at the time in the Kansas City area. Along with Social Work PRN, we partnered to provide that training, but we'd have 150 people for one day of training, so you had to find a venue.
Right.
So it was a massive undertaking, and anything like this piece of legislation, that's why it can take longer than you anticipate as well.
Absolutely. So is it written the way it should be written? Because for me, in looking at it and in analyzing it and thinking about it, there's a couple of things that always pop into my head. Number one, when it rolled out in January 1st of 2011, it actually didn't include me. I didn't have to take it. So I remember kind of joking, you know, with my partner, I guess they're not worried about my safety and your safety, Susan. And she's like, Craig, you know, come on. And I'm like, you know, so I'm curious about that. And then should it be a one-time training? Should it be, you know, Missouri does something interesting with their supervisor requirement. It's a 16-hour training, but the renewal every 2 years is 3 hours. So, you know, what about a renewal safety training, not a big chunk of 6 hours, but maybe 2 hours. Is there still ongoing discussion or consideration,
You
or is
know,
it just where it is right now and it is what it is?
yeah, I have not heard over the years that I was on the or on the Social Work Advisory Board. I never heard any discussion about making amendments or changes to it. And I had the same concerns, Gray, because I had never gone through a safety training as a social worker. And I was already licensed at the clinical level, so there was no mandate for me to attend it. I was fortunate because we put on so many of the safety trainings that I was able to be there. But so I think there were, again, as you mentioned with the renewal course as well, there are some pieces that never fully satisfy what the initial
Right.
maybe thought was. And I've seen that in other efforts that have been made with the Social Work Advisory Board to make some changes with social work licensing. I can give you some kind of background why there's maybe pushback on that, because some professionals who've been in the field for years don't want to, or feel like they don't need that training, or that there's always some professionals who don't think it applies to them. And so there's always that discussion of what are we going to do with that group of people? How do we satisfy that group of people? And then the cost and time frame is another factor where you get a little pushback. It's going to be kind of expensive for social workers who maybe don't have resources. So there's, but the renewal piece of it, I think you bring a good point. If you're trained once, doesn't it mean that throughout the course of your professional life that you might benefit from something every few years? I would agree.
When my KU students returned from the roundtable and debriefing after Terry's life was taken, I asked them, as I mentioned, we had our own little staff meeting. I said, "What did you all learn?" And all of the students said something. They said, "Well, what happened to Terry was very rare." And I said, "Yes, but being exposed to an angry, hostile, emotionally tense situations, angry clients, that is not rare."
Right.
So
absolutely.
I'll give kind of a sad story. I actually was in supervision with a young LMSW, and we were talking about safety. And we were talking about how when you're in a home, and if you have to get out of the home, how you get to the door, how you protect yourself, not turn your back on an angry client. And we're kind of role playing it a little bit, and we're kind of laughing in supervision. And that would happen to be on a Friday morning. And so we had our team meeting at noon, and then my staff dispersed. Well, she ended up being assaulted by a client about 4 o'clock that afternoon as she was coming back onto campus with him in her car. And even though we had had conversations that day about awareness, she still was assaulted, 5 hours later. So I do think that we need to constantly be aware of it. And I don't know that one training, does it. But I do think it is a no-brainer of a policy, makes total sense. And I'm so glad it's in place. And I really love your discussion about the time frame, because I want students to understand policy enactment, implementation, analysis. It has to be ongoing. It is not just a one-time, one-shot kind of deal. And when you get it in place, and then you go back and look at it 10 years later, your lens might change. So then you have other ideas or thoughts. Maybe for me, looking back on this, for the last 16 years since Terry's been gone. Sometimes we need to have policy analysis reviews because our lenses change.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing I I was so fortunate as a new social worker to have a mentor who was very much an advocate of getting familiarized with what it looks like to have some impact on policy. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to consider is, when there is a committee hearing on legislation that you care about, whether it's social work or a client or issue, is to go to Topeka or Jeff City and listen to those testimonies, because for me, it was, I mean, even like you said with Terry, the Safety Act, you would have thought that was a no-brainer, but there always is going to be some reason for some pushback. To hear people present in front of a hearing to the committee is really powerful. And it's also a good way for you to realize that you have testimony as well that you could prepare and provide if it was, again, something you cared about. Very early in my career, we had some major legislation or being proposed about social work licensing back in the late 90s. And I was one of the persons who provided some testimony way back then. And it was a little bit intimidating, but again, something that made me realize as a social worker is that we have a voice that we can use, and that's really important when it's something that you care a lot about or something that you think is important for others to consider. So I would not at all, as a student or at any point in your career, feel that you cannot be a part of that process.
Yeah, I want to echo that, Sherry. I know there's students that are in graduate school, they just want to be a therapist and they want to move on about, but I find that students know the first two sections in the Code of Ethics really well, Section 1, Section 2, but the other sections have some really strong language about our voice and about using our voice. And whether you're a BSW or an MSW, I think silence is not helpful. And I am with you. I think if you have an opportunity to step up, to advocate, your ethics says that you are to do that. So we are to have our voice to be heard. And I do think it is important, but it also requires us to listen to those around us. My mentor said something really wise to me one time. She said, when you're in a family support team meeting, or when you're in, an IEP meeting, or when you're in somewhere, because in essence, an IEP meeting is like a little mini policy institute. They're setting procedure in place for a child to have certain services. It is like a policy hearing, right? And my mentor said to me, always talk last. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood.
That's really
good. And I always thought that was really a powerful. So I always try to go last because I want to hear everybody's take on the procedure, the policy, the treatment plan, the treatment goal, whatever it is that we're having a discussion, because it might change on the fly.
Yeah, that's such a wise. That was wise. Yeah. You're going to make me think further about that, because my tendency is just to want to get it done. But no, that's really important. So, yeah, good.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry, for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think the students really will benefit. And students, if you're not familiar with Social Work PRN, please reach out to Sherry and introduce yourself. I know she's an awesome communicator, and I know she'd love to hear from you. So
thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Gray. Good luck to you all.